Around this time last year, when I released the mid-season review, there was a lot of uncertainty concerning the manager, the team, whether he could get something out of the remainder of the season, and whether he could keep his job. Well, he achieved more than I expected, leading us to top spot by New Year, comfortably runners-up in the league, but still disappointed in the Europa League final. In that previous season, after going out of the Champions League cheaply and with the kind of results we were getting last autumn, the Norwegian was lucky to keep his job, but not so this time around, as his side, that he'd put trust in, let him down again, and again, and again. Now we have Ralf Rangnick in to try and sort things out, and what a hell of a job he's got in his hands. I covered Ole's whole reign as well as the unravelling of the side's form in another recent video, The End of Ole, How Did We Get Here? There's a link in the description, so I really don't want to go through that in detail again, but I'll say just in summary, the boss was too nice and too indulgent with a side that possibly lost faith with him after the Villarreal failure. A win in that competition could have galvanised this side to really make a charge for premium silverware this season, with the elite signings that we made. It was also possible that some of his acquisitions, specifically Ronaldo, which could well have been forced upon him, may have messed up the boss's plans, and whilst I do see Ronaldo as an asset, could well have disrupted the balance in the squad at the beginning of the season, with already several new players in the dressing room that needed to be bedded in. It was clear by October that the players seemed to have downed tools, or at least their heads weren't in it, something that they still seem to have issues with today. Personally, I don't think that Ole had been the right man for the job for quite a while, but I supported the manager and always wanted him to win. But having lost the dressing room, there's only ever going to be one outcome, as Jose and David Moyes well know. As we know, the performances at the beginning of the season were generally good, the hammering of Leeds on the opening day being the main highlight for me. However, for those Reds not completely swept up in the return of CR7, there were clearly issues in matches that we ended up winning quite comfortably. The one that immediately springs to mind is the 4-1 home win against Newcastle. Up to a goalkeeping fumble just before the interval, the Geordies looked fairly comfortable and well drilled, defending in numbers. If they just maintained that after equalising early in the second half, we could have all foresawn with growing clarity what would be in store for us pretty much up until the point I'm writing this. The fortune we had in some games, especially in Europe as we rode our luck again and again, raised more and more red flags. But with the glory of comebacks and or last minute triumphs, these signals were on the whole collectively ignored. Only when we started to hit the predicted tricky patch in the autumn, starting with failures against West Ham in the League Cup at home and Everton in the league, did the majority of the faithful know that this situation was not going to get better, and that Solskjaer's days were numbered. Remarkably, losses to Leicester, then the worst performance I've ever seen as a United supporter against Liverpool and almost as bad soon after against City, weren't enough to displace him. Sir Alex offered a lifeline, supposedly, of 3 or more games to save himself after that Liverpool match. I'm not sure if that's complete BS, but a terrible defeat against a pathetic Watford side was the final match in the Norwegian's erratic regime. He was let down severely by the players that day, as he'd been for several weeks before, yet still picked them week in, week out. What's the Einstein quote? The definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again, expecting a different result, or something like that. Carrick did a solid job as temporary manager, remaining unbeaten and successfully guiding United to the Champions League knockout stages, which helped incumbent Ralf Rangnick a great deal. Better to start on some sort of solid foundation. However, that was pretty much all he was given. Despite a decent start to his regime with some good results and even a fine performance against Palace, the morale and attitude of much of the squad stinks. Maguire's uninspirational as captain, the young players generally don't seem to care, and former Reds like Lou Macari, Paul Scholes and Patrice Evra, and so on, have not held back on criticising the squad, its mentality, attitude and laziness. The players don't seem to have taken to the German who, after this start, will almost certainly be going upstairs in June, and not, as was noted on his arrival, would be able to carry on into next season if the remainder of the season went very well. That ship seems to have already clearly sailed. Rangnick's ideology is to work hard, continually pressing, which is a massive ask from almost all of this current squad. It's not expected that this would be able to be implemented overnight, but it seems that if the media is to be believed, the majority of the players are actively opposed to this level of hard work. It's shocking. I'm sure I don't need to go into a minutes-long rant on how bang out of order this is, and how it would never happen under Fergie, Big Ron, the Doc, or God help them Busby. It started so well. We'd brought in some elite players, Ronaldo, Varan and Sancho, all terrific signings. However, Varan and Sancho, due to different reasons, haven't bedded in yet. There was only one notable exit from the club, and that was young Dan James, who may not be blessed with the greatest ability in the world, but if the team had half as much heart and passion as him, maybe Ole would still be in charge. Apart from that, there were just a few players loaned out, when there should have been some definite exits or retirements, for the likes of Pereira, Martial, Mata, or one or more of the goalkeepers, and several others. The board justified a bloated squad as that was what Ollie wanted to work with at the beginning of the season, which was a strange admission and turned out to be an unnecessary strategy, as the boss seemed to generally play the same disappointing team every week and rarely went into depth with his side to keep the rest on their toes or look for a solution for poor individual performances, and collective ones for that matter. Onto the individual players, and I don't think it's a spoiler to let you know that this won't be pretty. But what's so perplexing is that all of them, to a man, have had good seasons in the past, most having won multiple trophies, so goodness knows what's happened to them. I've accused Ollie of being too indulgent, too nice, too smiley with his children, but there's something else, that malevolent force going around in the dressing room that has the symptoms of apathy, laziness, entitlement, sloppiness, conceit, and yet at the same time shamelessness. Anyway, onto the players. Let's have a look how they did. David De Gea has been immense. Back to his best in most games, but confusingly missing out on several Man of the Match awards, which went instead to Ronaldo, for last-minute equalisers or winners, but without the springy Spaniard being at his best in front of an inadequate and at times embarrassing defence, the Portuguese legend would have not been in a position to save the day, so to speak. Defensively, not even arguably the most disappointing of all the areas of the team, and it's the group of players who've let Ollie down the most. In general, Victor Lindelof has had a decent season, albeit the word decent is set at a far lower bar than in previous campaigns, but compared to the rest of the back four, it's pretty much a statement of fact. The captain, Harry Maguire, has regressed to, I don't know what, not a centre-back, not a leader, not an inspiration. This was a man who held the defence together at the back end of last season, and whose loss was really felt in the last handful of games and in the Europa League final. I'm not at all sure what he can do to get himself out of this malaise, but Ralf Rangnick must really consider dropping him until he gets his form back. Rafael Varan's maiden season in our famous old jersey has been plagued by injury, but when he's played he's looked lost, and certainly not the elite signing that we were mesmerised and relieved by when he came onto the pitch back in mid-August. Eric Bailly is having his perennial injury troubles coupled with the inability to string more than 2 good games together. Onto the fullbacks, and Luke Shaw for me is probably the most disappointing player of the season so far. Lauded as the best left back in Europe during the Euros, it seems to have gone to his head. Disinterested, lazy, sloppy, almost to the point of being unprofessional. Shaw has a lot of work to do to repair his damaged reputation. Wan-Bissaka would be competing with Luke Shaw for the most disappointing player prize, but I think Shaw still edges it, falling so far down from so high up, whereas the Spider has never been that highly rated or has been in such a lofty position in people's minds. That said, he has been poor defensively, as well as going forward. His United career is hanging by a thread. Dalot and Tellers have had a handful of appearances lately once the old boss had gone, with Tellers actually having some decent performances for the Red Devils. He's not been spectacular, but certainly a distinct improvement over Shaw. Dalot has been less convincing, but at least he's getting his chance to play now. Credit to the lad for playing on against Villa in the cup match recently, despite a deep gash on his ankle. I just want to make an honorary mention about Phil Jones, who despite all the abuse and mockery over the last few years, came on the pitch against Wolves showing why Fergie had such faith in the lad, and has demonstrated what it is to play for the badge. It's a shame that so few of his colleagues seem to have noticed. Onto midfield, and McFred seriously let the manager down, especially the second part of that portmanteau. If I'm especially kind, McTominay may not have always had great games but usually gives his all, whilst his midfield partner gets paid 6 times as much and has often not done half as well, although he seems to be playing a bit better under the German. Pogba needs to go. He's injured or moaning or underperforming, yet we want to offer him more money to stay? What on earth is the club, Rangnick, all the management thinking? The shrewd Scot who let him go the first time around knew what he was doing. Matic has been alright, but far from anything special, and the less that's said about the Donny van de Beek snafu, the better. Bruno has looked like a shadow of his former self. He wasn't amazing in the back end of last season, but since the arrival of his countryman has looked even more bereft of direction, confidence and his place in the team. Onto the wingers, and Marcus Rashford has troubled me for a couple of seasons now. At last term he had the excuse, or was at least provided with the excuse by a number of Reds, that he was carrying an injury, and once it was remedied we'd have the old Rash back and then some. Well, he chose not to rule himself out of the Euros, unlike Mason Greenwood, who was carrying an injury as well, but instead had his op after he'd come back off holiday post-tournament, even though his inclusion in games in this summer's tournament seemed no more than a gesture by Gareth Southgate. Anyway, he missed the start of the season, and since then has shown no improvement on the last campaign. In fact, he's gone backwards. Mason Greenwood has had some decent performances when things were going well at the start of the season, but recently seemed to have suffered some of the same downturn in form and morale as many of his teammates. You can hardly blame him. If the senior players come into training with negative attitudes, you'd have to have a strong personality to buck the trend. Jaden Sancho was also disappointed, played out of position. It took him months to score for the club. And this is not the Dortmund player that has impressed in recent seasons. Again, if you come into an unprofessional dressing room as a young lad and he's still only 21, it's hard to battle against it. Edinson Cavani will always have the United fans' hearts as he constantly puts the shift in and leads by example, but his lack of game time due to injury and the previous boss feeling it necessary to start with Ronaldo ahead of him pretty much every game has meant we've not seen the best of him. I'm happy though that he's committed himself to us for the rest of the season. God knows we need him. Finally, the man himself, Cristiano Ronaldo. If you look at the plain stats, few could argue it's been a triumphant return so far, at least from a personal perspective. And it's true, how many winning goals and how much inspiration have the side garnered from this all-time footballing legend. But also, how much did his arrival disrupt all his plans? I'm guessing he wasn't on the Norwegians' wish list. Ronaldo is a massive character which seemed to have had a positive impact at the beginning, but look at how Bruno has regressed and how CR7 has just recently complained that the younger players don't listen to advice. He left one of the best sides in Europe 12 years ago, but has come back to this shambles. No wonder he's incredulous about the situation. So where do we go from here? What should United aim for in the second half of the season? Player-wise, we need to let loose as quickly as possible in this transfer window. The likes of Pogba, Martial and Henderson need to go. There are other candidates, but these three seem to be fairly obvious. Inbound, what don't we need? Striker, centre-back, centre-mid. Blood some more of the youth side, I say. If they're as passionate and competent as Elanga, it may be a good move. On the pitch, so after all of this mess, what league position should we be aiming for in the latter half of the season? Obviously, if possible, top four, but the way we're playing and how the players are revolting against Ralph, getting them to run a bit, it'll be a stretch. Securing a Europa League spot would be disappointing, albeit more realistic, but the Europa Conference? Unthinkable. The FA Cup clearly seems to be our best bet for silverware. After barely setting Villa aside a few days ago and getting Borough in the fourth round, we need our fair share of luck and some good performances. The Champions League is well beyond us, and any kind of progression, seeing as we're playing the Spanish champions Atletico Madrid next, would be a minor miracle. Anything from the quarterfinals onward would be a bonus. So how will our expectations tally with our targets until mid-May? I actually believe we'll end up with a Europa League spot, after Ralph finally gets something out of this lazy bunch, with a major clear-out on the cards for whichever presumably elite manager we manage to snag in the summer. The FA Cup will be good until we meet a decent opponent, where we'll struggle unless the German is able to sort them out by February onwards. And finally, we'll be lucky to get past Atletico in the Champions League. The outlook is very bleak to me for the rest of the season. We could have a bump come April, or if you want to be optimistic, March, once the side starts waking up to itself and plays as it should, but that could be too little too late to salvage something from this campaign. So what did you make of our season so far? Were the club right to sack Ollie when they did? Should they have done it before? Should we shift several members of the squad in the January transfer window? And who should go? On a more positive note, which player or players have actually done well so far in your opinion? After you've commented, if you haven't already done so, please like, share and subscribe. As always, thank you for your support.